Comencem la segona sessió del Seminari d'Història Política i Cultural. Avui tenim una sessió, com veieu aquí, com us poso clar, en anglès. Això ho dic per endavant. Les preguntes, després comentaris, les podeu fer en Spanish o Italian o en anglès, òbviament. I tenim amb nosaltres la professora Martina Salvante, que és professora al Departament d'Història de la Universitat de Nottingham, al Regne Unit, que ha fet diverses estades de recerca en universitats europees, és doctora per European University Institute de Firenze, i entre d'altres coses importants per comentar és becària o fellowship Marie Curie, que és una de les beques més prestigioses a nivell europeu, i diguem-ne entre les seves els centres d'interès a nivell de recerca, i això és el que ens interessava especialment avui en el context del nostre projecte de recerca centrat en la primera postguerra mundial a nivell europeu. S'ha especialitzat i ha publicat recentment diferents articles i treballs vinculats a la qüestió que ens ocupa avui, com un article centrat en el trauma de la primera postguerra italiana i en els cossos, diguem-ne, masculins, i el trauma i les conseqüències físiques, però sobretot, en aquest tema que veieu aquí avui, sobre la reinserció en la vida civil d'aquests veterans de la Primera Guerra Mundial d'Itàlia. Un tema sobre el qual, ja sabeu, hem anat donant voltes i treballem, hem treballat a través de diferents intervencions, diferents ponències en aquest seminari, i que ens interessa especialment per les potencials comparacions, vincles amb el cas de la postguerra espanyola sense haver intervingut en la guerra. Per tant, thank you so much for being here, Tina, and it's a pleasure to share this morning with you today.
And thank you, Maxi, thank you, Sumta, thank you, Georgia, for your invitation to present here. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and exactly, I take this opportunity to discuss my current research project, which is a book provisionally titled Disabled Veterans of the First World War in Interwar Italy. So as Maxi just said, actually I'm very interested in sort of comparisons here related to the First World War and the interwar period, and as you'll see in a moment in my paper, discussing for sure the return of disabled veterans to civilian life and the specific political and social context in which this return happened. And as you'll see in a moment, is also very much about also political violence and how we can look at political violence and the involvement of disabled veterans in that. So this is also, I'm happy to be here to present this paper, which is actually part of an article that I'm now trying to finish, so I'll be very happy for your comments, our discussion, in order to complete and submit this article. So please, again, don't hesitate to ask questions or comments at the end of my presentation. And I've started working on this project, as Maxi just said, when I was Marie Curie or Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellow some years ago. And the project is the book project is slowly going forward in line with other numerous commitments and lots of teaching in the UK. But the idea is to investigate the destinies of the men who returned from the Great War battlefields with physical and sensory impairments. And I specify this because in my view there's been more written on the psychological disablements and less on the physical and sensory ones, in particular for the Italian case. And so that's why I'm also interested in trying to retrieve the experiences of these men. The project sets out to examine the personal, social, and political dynamics underlying the reintegration in post-war Italy by focusing on their rehabilitation and return to family life and work, as well as on the interactions with the political culture and the social climate they were immersed in. And it does so by paying attention it does so by paying attention to, as you can see here on the slide, first, the creation of welfare measures destined to disabled veterans. Second, civil society's initiatives in their support. And third, which is for me very important, the varied self-advocacy movement of disabled veterans. And again, I specify here disabled veterans, and in a moment I explain why. And fourth, the ways various political actors engaged with disabled veterans and vice versa. So how disabled veterans also interacted and engaged with variety of political actors. The rise of the fascist movement from 1919 and its successive rise to power in founding of a single-party state in the 20s sharply redefined the dominant narrative of the First World War by emphasizing a positive myth of the war experience at the expense of overlooked veterans, whose diversity of experiences often belied such rhetoric. So the broader project attempts to address significant gaps in our knowledge by examining diverse stories of Italian disabled veterans within and beyond Italy's borders and throughout the interwar period. So again, very interested actually as well. I don't speak much today in my paper about also these transnational networks. Something might come up later in the discussion, but it's again something I'm particularly interested in. Relation between disabled veterans, Italian disabled veterans living abroad that had served in the First World War, and so with the Italian communities abroad, but also with disabled veterans in other, or veterans more broadly in other countries, especially in Europe, because of the creation of transnational movements and networks since 1917. So my talk today, and here you have a sort of outline of my paper today. So there was a bit the broader perspective of my book project, and this is my paper. We'll focus on some of the issues that I just mentioned to you, and in particular on the interactions between disabled veterans and Italy's post-war political culture. Specifically, I will illustrate the role of disabled veterans in the post-war context of socio-political crisis and violent confrontation that witnessed the rise of fascism in Italy. I argue, and this is my argument, that the experience of disabled veterans should be distinguished from that of their able-bodied comrades. The reasons of their organization and the kinds of even violent actions carried out by them diverged from those undertaken by other veterans, although they all shared, in many cases, a longing for a radical renewal of Italian politics. So what I'm trying to do is to bring into dialogue modern social movement studies, disability theory, and the recent historiography on political violence and demobilization. in order to use disability as a useful category of analysis when discussing the transition from war to peace and the rise of fascism. And I will do so by raising attention to the creation of organized forms of advocacy for the war disabled, the various claims, and the struggles in the early post-war years, the bargaining with Italian governments, and ultimately the convergence with fascism in the mid-20s. So to go into details about what was the situation in Italy, so economic reconversion, social reconstruction, and the demobilization and reintegration of millions of veterans posed serious challenges and troubled all the states in the aftermath of the First World War. Yet, the situation in Italy was further complicated by serious political and economic crises and intense internal divisions. Italy, moreover, was the only victorious country where post-war violence and political turmoil led to the emergence of a dictatorship. Here, on the slide, you see again some data and a sort of important dates defining the experience of disabled veterans. So, demobilization in Italy was a challenging and slow-paced process. At the close of hostilities, you see here on the slide some data, the Italian army in the field still number 81,687 officers and more than 2 million men. And the discharge started at the end of 1918, so with the end of hostilities, with the release of those born in a specific period, so in the decade 1874-1884, but the army was fully demobilized only in 1921. And ex-soldiers returned home to find themselves without employment, a situation that contributed to stir social discontent and unrest. And obviously these happen not only in Italy. And I mentioned here, for example, historian Deborah Cohen has significantly underlined, and I quote, "No country was spared mass protest by disgruntled ex-servicemen in the immediate post-war years," end quotation. Because their dissatisfaction with their status endangered, in many cases, the transition to peace. The situation was even more complicated for those who had been severely wounded in war service and returned home unfit for profitable work. Since Italy's entry into the war in May 1915, much of the aftercare offered to disabled soldiers had been organized through local groups and private initiatives. The war had been raging for some time, in fact, before the Italian government intervened to formally take control of charitable activities and organize the provision of welfare. In particular, as you see here on the slide, there's an agency that became very important. In 1917, the Italian government regulated the support for impaired servicemen by establishing the Opera Nazionale per la Protezione e l'Assistenza agli Invalidi di Guerra. I don't know if I should translate it into English, probably it's clear enough. So, the National Agency for the Protection and Assistance of Men Disabled in the War. And this was a public agency in charge of the medical, prosthetic, material, social, and legal assistance of disabled veterans, and was funded through the Ministry of the Interior. Disabled servicemen could be admitted into rehabilitation centers for a period of 15 days and 6 months, so in between, at the expense of the military administration, while receiving a daily allowance according to the military rank. in their reskilling would not compromise the right to war pensions. And I say that because there was a lot of discussion transnationally about the fact that many disabled veterans did not go to rehabilitation centers because they were afraid of losing the right to their war pensions. So governments across Europe in particular, they had to clarify that, again, they would have not lost right to the pensions if retrained and rehabilitated. So the Opera Nazionale per la Protezione e l'Assistenza degli Invalidi di Guerra, however, was underfunded and understaffed, and its function highly compromised, therefore. Its potential beneficiaries often criticized its malfunctioning, as well as they blamed the slowness of bureaucracy in assessing and granting war pensions. In such a situation lasted for some years, as insistently denounced by veterans on their press organs. And to put the Italian disabled veterans in context, those who had been injured as a result of military amounted to 450 or 460,000, against a total of 4,200,000 men sent to the front. The most recent research, however, has downsized the number to the lower figure of about 270,000. And even if we consider this a more conservative estimate, it does suggest that disabled veterans were a major presence in post-war society, and a reasonably large proportion of the total number of ex-servicemen. So demobilization plunged many of those returning men into unemployment, for Italy was also torn by a profound economic crisis. And the failed reintegration of thousands of veterans on the job market intensified their discontent as they felt left to their own devices by state authorities. The situation was even, as I earlier said, was even more complicated for invalids, since in many cases, rehabilitation and vocational retraining programs had been ineffective, and they continuously encountered tangible problems in finding and securing jobs. This prompted the short-lived government led by Ivano Bonomi between July 1921 and February 1922. So again, as you see, a very short-lived liberal government, to introduce a law concerning the mandatory employment of disabled veterans, both in the public and private sectors. And again, I think this is very important because it had been discussed also across Europe, in these transnational networks that I mentioned earlier on, if employment or government should issue mandatory employment for disabled veterans or not. Different governments took different decisions. And again, Italy was one of those, as I said, in 1921, introducing this law. So this act, what this act implies, provided that all employers of labor using more than 10 male manual workers or 5 male non-manual workers shall employ one disabled man for every 20 employees. Again, to give you an idea of what it meant for employers. But a 1923 study on the employment of disabled men compiled by the newly recently established Geneva-based International Labour Office exposed a partial implementation of this law in Italy, where employers had not been properly monitored, or many had requested an exemption from the implementation of this law. So again, already in 1923 was denounced that the law was ineffective. But returning to work was a top priority for veterans, who through their self-advocacy associations had solicited state-secured employment. And the 1921 law introducing compulsory or mandatory employment for the war disabled had been favorably welcomed by veterans organizations. Some time later, however, those same associations disapproved of the law's implementation, as I said, because considered ineffective, which was not seen up to standards. But what were these self-advocacy associations? So, disabled veterans had begun organizing themselves into associations well before the war ended. Sorry, here is about the law that I just mentioned, my apologies. Again, issued in August 1921. I'm gonna, sorry, my apologies. Yeah, great. And this is the Associazione Nazionale fra Mutilati e Invalidi di Guerra, that was founded in April 1917. So as you see, already, so still when the war was ongoing, with the support and participation of both officers and rank-and-file soldiers. Again, it's an association directed at expressively involving disabled soldiers and officers, since both contributed to its establishment. In the general appeal, and I think it's also significant, it's April 1917, and 17 is a key year in my view, but obviously not only my views, for many historians, also in the First World War. And I think it's also key because of the creation of self-advocacy associations among disabled veterans. In their general appeal to the nation, the disabled pointed out that their future, and I quote, would be full of difficulties, and war pensions would not be enough, end quote. They even added, and I quote again, we want to work. We feel the duty to be Italians who are useful to our nation, to be citizens able to support our families, end quote. So the formal establishment of the group occurred on the 29th April 1917 in Milan, again, another key city in the history of Italy, and especially in those years between the First World War and the early post-war period. On that occasion, it was stressed that, although physically disabled, the members felt equal to the able-bodied because of the sacrifices they had made in the name of a new era of peace. And that's also what they use, the term peace. On one hand, the invalids underlined what distinguished them from the majority. On the other, so the fact that they were disabled, but on the other, they were determined not to be excluded from the wider Italian society. So, disability became a new facet of their own identity, which prompted them to organize and act collectively, in the name, again, of their having been severely wounded in the war. Nonetheless, many impaired veterans, and I think that's what's important to emphasize, did not want to see themselves as disabled, and thus downplayed the significance of their disabilities. They rather preferred to define themselves through other aspects of their identity, political allegiance, profession, regional origin, as I said, active service on the front lines of the Great War. But others, on the contrary, made the word disabled label into a badge to demand rights and assistance. Again, here, interestingly enough, is you see the front page of Il Popolo d'Italia, so the journal established by Benito Mussolini, presenting, sorry, you say, if I can move here, again, reported about the organization of the association, as you can see, is in the front cover, and there was a lot of attention given by Mussolini and its newspaper to the organization of the association. So on the day of Italy's victory over Austria-Hungary in November 1918, the association had issued a manifesto to the country, and you see here the manifesto was presented on the bulletin or newspaper issued by the association itself, so that organized also the publication of this bollettino, and so they wanted to share this manifesto to the country, obviously with the audience. So in this manifesto, disabled veterans claimed their role as living warnings against barbarism and ascribed themselves the task of pointing out the steps necessary for a national transformation. So again, it's interesting the kind of words and rhetoric they used. sort of warning against barbarism. As I mentioned, they also speak about peace, and as I said, they also, in the manifesto, they present different steps towards national transformation. The manifesto, which encompassed moral, socio-economic and political considerations, stated that, and I quote, "War handicapped and invalids represented the aristocracy of sacrifice and virtue of Italy, and that the nation indisputably owed them a safe and decorous life." End quote. It also asserted their wish not to become, and I quote again, "a dead loss for the nation, but rather a vivid energy for its reconstruction." End quote. So the representatives of the association, and I might say also of other associations of disabled veterans that I will mention in a moment, wanted to speak for their members' needs and to cooperate with the authorities in their aftercare and welfare. Government forces had looked somehow favorably at the creation of an association among war invalids in the hope that this might keep its members away from the influence of socialism. Indeed, the association described itself as an apolitical organization. Nonetheless, also the Socialist Party and its newspaper Avanti expressed their interest for these initiatives since the outset. So you have seen also Benito Mussolini and Il Popolo d'Italia manifesting interest in the creation of the association. Same happened for the Socialist Party. Its newspaper Avanti, they were reporting the organization of the associations, and again, they were very interested in these new initiatives. But what is more, at the end of 1918, a group of former ex-servicemen and war victims in general, and they use the term war victims, formed the Lega Proletaria Mutilati, Invalidi, Reduci, Genitori e Vedove dei Caduti in Guerra. So again, in this case, a kind of broader association, because he wanted to involve not only who were disabled, but also their families, the families of those who were fallen. And this Lega in particular had the endorsement, the explicit endorsement of the Socialist Party and of the Socialist Labour Union, Confederazione Generale del Lavoro. So again, the Associazione Nazionale was not the only one that was created in the post-war period, just after the end of the war. Its remit of the Lega was to connect war victims' claims with the general aspirations and struggles of the working class. Because of its political allegiance, however, the Lega Proletaria was largely opposed both by the authorities and other groups of disabled veterans. As I said earlier on, the Associazione Nazionale, which was the most important because it had many members, presented itself as apolitical, while obviously the Lega was close to the Socialist Party, and that's also why both authorities and other groups opposed it. And the exacerbation of political violence in Italy and the rise of fascism marked the end of the Lega Proletaria's activities at latest in 1925. But there were other organizations, and I'll briefly mention them just to give you an idea of the interest coming from veterans in organizing themselves. In order to self-advocate, to advocate their own claims. And I think it's interesting to look at the wider spectrum of organizations, because again, some of them had definitely a political belief, some others organized themselves because closer either to the Catholic religion or some others because of the regions they were from. I mention here in particular the Turin based, again still in northern Italy, Associazione Nazionale Reduci Zona Operante. There are definitely smaller groups, and also the Associazione Nazionale Combattenti that was constituted at the end of 1918, which sought to group together all the servicemen who had fought on the front line, while at the beginning of 1919, the Arditi, former elite assault troopers, also established their own association, the Associazione fra gli Arditi d'Italia, which was characterized by a distinctly anti-socialist ethos. And then it was also the turn of the fascist movement, which Benito Mussolini inaugurated in Milan on the 20th of March 1919. And even though this latter was not an association exclusively addressed to former servicemen, we know, scholars have pointed out, that and local figures demonstrate that more than half of fascist members in 1921, for example, were war veterans. And yet, the assumption that veterans were invariably sympathetic to conservatism and rightist positions misrepresents their diverse experiences and allegiances. And I think, again, recent scholarship had tried to, in a way, to investigate more closely this association between war veterans and fascism. And that's exactly what I also am trying to do, and to contribute to this discussion that have enriched scholarship in the last years. Although many veterans engaged in forms of political activism and even violence, the majority, and I think that's important to emphasize, of demobilized soldiers and officers simply focused on returning home and resuming their pre-war working and private lives. These veterans' associations were not, though, mere species of interaction among former members of the armed forces. They also worked in some cases as political platforms. And what I mean here with political platforms. So more specifically, the organizations of disabled veterans should be regarded as social movements employing collective action. And according to modern social movement studies, because again, this idea of employing a social movement theory that's been used in the 70s, but I think the modern social movement studies can help us all better to define the actions and experiences of the members of these groups. So according to modern social movement studies, and you see here also on the slide, the four conceptual distinctions that shape our understanding of social movements. First of all, they are collective organized efforts. Second, they exist over a period of time. Third, the members share a collective identity. And fourth, they pursue change by employing protest. So all these traits apply to our case, or my case, the case I'm sharing with you. And protest can be understood as the implementation of acts of disruption or declaration of disapproval. More specifically, it can be divided into three categories: numbers, damage, and bearing witness. And today I explicitly focus on the damage or the acts of violence against property and persons caused by the disabled. So violence has usually both symbolic and instrumental aims. It acts as a symbolic refusal of an oppressive system, but it is also used to win specific battles or to obtain media attention. So this does not mean that all disabled veterans embrace violence, but rather that in many cases they stage their disruptive acts mainly as, that's how they presented it, last resort to criticize the neglect of the government or to pressurize the parliament into approving relevant legislation. So there are smaller scale forms of violence, hard, in my view, and again, I'm obviously here to discuss it with you, are to be differentiated from the continuum of violent tactics that exemplify the much more organized acts of political violence performed, for example, by fascist squads. However, it should be acknowledged that the acts of violence perpetrated by disabled veterans may well have contributed to the delegitimization of the liberal state and its ruling elite in the eyes of the public, and thus exacerbated the effects of the numerous episodes of political violence increasingly occurring in the country at that time. And here I'm referring particularly to these early post-war years. And to better contextualize veterans' use of force, I refer here to historians Mark Idele and Robert Gervart's discussion of demobilization. They, and you see also here, so Idele and Gervart identify 4 decisive factors causing the post-war continuation of violence. First, the strength of the state to which former soldiers returned. Second, the survival of pre-existing conflicts along class or ethnic lines amplified by the war. Third, the threat of a Bolshevist revolution coupled with pre-existing conflicts. And finally, the degree to which veterans could be successfully reintegrated into civilian life, either through material or symbolic compensation. And I think each of these factors played somehow their role in the Italian context, but I mostly rely today on the fourth one. So the successfully or not successfully reintegration, successful or not successful reintegration into civilian life of disabled veterans. So to demonstrate how disabled veterans gradually converged around fascism. Veterans who had been disabled because of war service often felt betrayed and embittered because of the slowness of Italian politics and bureaucracy in introducing and implementing the directives they were demanding, and to which they felt they were entitled. So please remember the manifesto they issued already at the very end of the war. So with specific steps to be taken by authorities, again, to transform Italian society and politics. These inefficiently gradually so again, this slowness of bureaucracy, and this inefficiency gradually compromised disabled veterans' relations with the democratic institutions and moved them closer to a political movement, fascism, which promised them a prominent position within society, as well as material and symbolic compensations. Disabled veterans had to cope first and foremost with their physical and mental trauma. But quite apart from the private coming to terms with disability, their new condition required consistent contact with both military and civil authorities at local and national levels to solicit war pensions and medical assistance. So I think that's important that we keep this in mind, what it meant then to, obviously, to have been wounded, and what it meant also in terms of contact and interaction with authorities, as I said, both military and civil ones. Disabled veterans thus confronted the ruling elites in a variety of circumstances, whether negotiating with them or objecting to their decisions, thus contributing for their part to that social and political ferment which characterized post-war Italy. And it is in this context that disabled veterans encountered, clashed, or mingled with the fascist movement first, and with fascism in power later. The War Disabled Associations did not merely offer opportunities for socialization among former brothers in arms. They also acted as mediating structures in civil society, pleading in favor of their members while interacting with state bureaucracies. Even if they were not politically affiliated, their actions were intended to orient politics. And that's why I mentioned earlier on we should look at them as obviously political platforms, even if they presented themselves as apolitical groups. Employment and job placement were key issues in facilitating a smooth transition to peace. The search of employment was indeed an essentially human response to the resumption of civilian life, so to leave the war behind and return to normalcy. And again, what is normalcy in the case of men who had been severely injured and wounded during the conflict? The capacity to earn a living was also part of the normative expectations of masculinity. as men were conventionally regarded as primary providers. As Maxi said about myself when introducing me to you, I'm interested in gender as well, and I think in particular here in my research I intersect gender and disability, so I focus on masculinity and disability, and I think it's something that we have to keep in mind when considering the experiences of these men and their attempt to return to, as I said, a sort of normalcy and what normalcy meant for them. If the mobilization presented all servicemen with challenges as they attempted to take up previous affairs or jobs and resume their pre-war social and family interactions, homecoming was charged with a particular intense anxiety for those who were returning to civilian life with a disability. In many cases, disabled veterans were afraid that their loss of physical ability could compromise their preferred performance of masculinity as physical laborers, thus jeopardizing the conventional association between masculinity and economic productivity, and hence the association between masculinity and authority. The financial straits caused by unemployment, the struggle to find their place again in the Italian society despite their disability, and the desire to reassess publicly the masculinity fueled the protest and non-violent violent actions staged by disabled ex-servicemen in the early post-war period. And I mention here some examples, obviously, to make it clear. In 1920, disabled veterans engaged in a series of protests and occupations throughout the country. The protracted indifference of both government and public opinion had driven them to resort to clamorous actions to draw attention to the quite alarming conditions. From February 1920, they started to vocally express their dissatisfaction with the existing policies and invited the government to introduce new measures such as raising war pensions and a plan for the employment of disabled veterans. Again, we're here in 1920. You have seen that in 1921, then the government issued a law demanding mandatory employment for disabled veterans. So, but again, everything started with 1920s and and the protests and occupations staged by disabled veterans. In one editorial, so in an article in the bulletin of the Associazione Nazionale Mutilati Invalidi, it was clearly explained that the ingratitude of the rulers had made the disabled feel forgotten, and that they, I quote, would therefore have to take to the streets to reproach the oblivious and blame the absentees through their telling and everlasting sacrifices, end quote. Disappointed and disillusioned, the wartime disabled complain about the social invisibility and the indifference shown by both the government and the public opinion regarding their plight. They gave advance notice that they would use, so they said it in their articles, in the bulletins, so they gave advance notice that they would use the bodies to physically occupy public spaces and key locations to become visible again. It is startling to observe how the use of the disabled bodies as a protest tool was directly linked to radical active politics. The physical otherness was publicly and animatedly exhibited as a marker of sacrifice and hence an entitlement to visibility and compensation. I argue that this centrality of the physical body, even as a protest tool, powerfully distinguishes the condition of disabled veterans from that of their able-bodied comrades. Here you see two photos depicting, two different moments, 1920 and 1921, depicting, again, these protests and occupations, in particular in Rome, so in the capital. Indeed, in 1920, they essentially gave the Italian government an ultimatum. They would engage in intense demonstrations unless it implemented the measures they had recommended. As I said, they are continuously engaging in negotiations with the authorities, the central authorities. So the leading figures of the Associazione Nazionale Mutilati e Invalidi explained why they would resort to the use of violence, stating that they would exercise, and I quote, influence through violence and, just as importantly, the prospect of violence, end quote, in order to have the claims accepted. In December 1920, the association vehemently demonstrated opposite the Villa Massimo in Rome, and even more intensely in front of Palazzo Montecitorio, where the Chamber of Deputies had its office. Disabled veterans gathered at the latter location on the 18th December to publicly support the approval of a bill concerning their pensions. Some of them even tried to break into the building, thus provoking the interventions of the Royal Guards. The demonstration degenerated into a scene of chaotic public disturbance, with screamings, stones throwing, gunshots, and beatings. And over the following 2 days, the disabled gathered intimidatingly in the square and succeeding in breaking through the police forces and entering the palazzo over again. According to a press report of the incident, and I quote, the disabled were determined, without any fuss, to prevent by way of violence the exit of the deputies, end quote, in order to make them discuss the bill concerning their situation. Eventually, the veterans' public exasperation and rather radical tactics brought about the desired outcomes, that is to say, the revision of unequal pension distributions and a partial rise in the total amounts. So this is at the end of 1920. Even though these protests derived from the specific condition of disability experienced by these veterans, I think we shouldn't forget that they inserted themselves in an already heated socio-political context. So they were not the only one engaging in violence in Italy at that time. Already in November 1920, a scene of carnage had occurred at Palazzo d'Accursio in Bologna, followed by a bloodshed at the Stenze Castle in Ferrara in December. Again, key moments that explicit the rise of fascism and their tactics of political violence. And the year would end with the so-called Bloody Christmas, so 1920, would end with the Bloody Christmas in Fiume, Rijeka. Because of the Treaty of Rapallo signed by the Italian and the Yugoslav governments on the 12th November 1920, the Italian Royal Army, led by General Enrico Caviglia, brutally intervened to put an end to Gabriele D'Annunzio regency of the Carnaro. And Fiume was subsequently declared a free city. So I think that's important, obviously, to contextualize disabled veterans' tactics and protests within what was happening across the country. And exactly, so we know that the use of paramilitary violence by fascist squads was escalating under the eyes of an often complicit police force. So, as you can see here, again, 1920 key, but also protests continued in 1921. Demonstrations kept occurring all through 1921. In April, for instance, hundreds of invalids took possession of the headquarters of the government's own railroad company, Ferrovie dello Stato, in Rome, and prevented female employees from entering the building and reaching their workplace. According to police sources, I quote, the disabled, who were in an excited state, resisted against any attempt to be removed. Some, while getting on the ground, again, they used their bodies to protest, said they would prefer getting killed rather than leaving the building. End quote. They would stay to deny access to female employees. It was through the expulsion of women from the job market that disabled veterans intended to reassert their virility and hence their exclusive entitlement to work. The job market was seen, in fact, as essentially male. These men who had been disfigured, lost limbs or body functionality in the war were often anxious about a potential reshaping of their male role and identity, we could say, which had traditionally been based on working, breadwinning, and exercising authority. So the employment of women in the public sector was perceived by many of them as an attack on their already compromised masculinity, or what they perceived as a compromised masculinity. The newly acquired and contested visibility of women in the workforce was felt as endangering by those men who are striving themselves for social consideration and job placement in the aftermath of the conflict. So similar protests happened in Rome in February 1921, when members of the Associazione Nazionale Mutilati Invalidi di Guerra took possession, for example, of the branch of the Istituto Nazionale delle Assicurazioni, so the National Insurance Institute, devoted to the insurance services for servicemen. In February 1921, representatives of both the National Insurance Institute and the association reached an agreement to put an end to the occupation of the building. The arrangement entailed the replacement of female casual personnel with veterans, the war disabled, widows or orphans, and again, it's interesting, some widows were also accepted as employees, but widows of those fallen in the war. Under its terms, the number of female employees was not to exceed 20% of the overall workforce. In a letter that the leadership of the National Insurance Institute wrote to the Ministry of the Interior in November 1922, it was clearly stated that 350 female employees out of the 650 employed during the war years had been dismissed to make way for 400 demobilized and disabled soldiers. So this is November 1922. So he was writing the leadership of the National Insurance Institute to as I said, the Ministry of Interior. In particular, was communicated with the Undersecretary Aldo Finzi, who was a member of the Fascist Party, which had very recently risen to power at the end of October 1922. So the transition to again this coalition government led by Benito Mussolini had just happened. Fascist leader Benito Mussolini had been appointed president of the Council of Ministers by the king, with the promise that he would restore order in the country and demobilize the thousands of fascists who were marching on the capital, Rome. So 1 month after the march on Rome, the Director General of the National Insurance Institute asked the Ministry of the Interior, now led by Benito Mussolini himself, to implement all feasible measures to avoid veterans' protest against the Institute. So when Mussolini rose to power after the March on Rome in October 1922, the disabled expected a reform of war pensions, which had been already promised by the previous government. But it was Mussolini's cabinet that managed to compose and deliver the reform of war pensions, thus gaining the support of disabled veterans. And it is central to the getting closer of the movement to fascism. So 1923 is a key moment, in particular the reform of war pensions. And you see here again, that's the reform of war pensions. Obviously, it's the text in Italian, but to show you when then the decree was issued in July 1923. So the matter of war pensions were resolved exactly in the summer 1923, when the new reform was finally issued. As I said, there had been a long negotiations with previous governments. The route towards its achievement had been rough and strewn with controversies. One major bone of contention concerned the distinction between those who benefited illegitimately from war pensions and those who were worth receiving them. The Associazione Nazionale Mutilati e Invalidi di Guerra warmly thanked Mussolini for this achievement in the summer 1923, thus drawing nearer to the fascist leader. And conversely, Mussolini took advantage of the new law to present himself as a champion of veterans' rights and requests. What is more, while the government took on a more direct control of institutions after its rise to power of Mussolini, and again Mussolini taking the office of president of the Council of Ministers, So the government recognized the association Associazione Nazionale Mutilati e Invalidi di Guerra, as well as another association, Associazione Nazionale Combattenti, as the only moral and material representatives of veterans and war victims in any dealing with authorities. And that meant that other groups, for example, the Lega Proletaria that I mentioned earlier on, were ostracized and again, not recognized officially by the government. The reform of war pensions introduced important changes, not only in the popular and official perceptions of ex-combatants, but also regarding the practical benefits of which these men could avail themselves. In the report introducing the new law, it was solemnly stated that, and I quote, war pensions were benefits with which the state provided both those who had become unfit for work due to war service and the families of the fallen, end quote. The pension was to be seen as a compensation merely for the material and economic damage ensued while in war service, but never for pain and suffering. By their allocation, the state was seen to be carrying out its moral duty to support those who had most generously served it. The promulgation of the law, as I said, was only a first, but sound convergence between the government led by fascist leader Benito Mussolini and disabled veterans, grouped in particular in the Associazione Nazionale Mutilati e Invalidi di Guerra. What is more, the following year, 1924, witnessed the election to the presidency of the Associazione of Carlo Del Qua, who in that same year was also voted to the Chamber of Deputies among the ranks of the national list, or listone in Italian, that assembled fascists and nationalists. The convergence between the Associazione Nazionale Mutilati e Invalidi and fascism became therefore ever more unavoidable. Also because it's a crucial year, 1924, as I imagine you might be familiar with the crucial year 1924 in Italian politics, or again we can engage on it later in our discussion. So coming to my conclusions, in my talk today, I have sought to reassess the role of disabled veterans in post-World War I context of social-political crisis and violent confrontation, which witnessed the rise of fascism in Italy. Disabled veterans took the lead, in Italy as elsewhere, in making claims for all ex-servicemen as a matter of right and not charity. Hence, a range of organizations emerged across the political spectrum to voice their requests. In the Italian case, however, even the self-proclaimed apolitical groups were not entirely able to remain above the fray and rather became actors in the political violence and governmental instability of the early post-war period. And although the moral weight of the disabled veterans' claims amounted to an important independent factor in social protest and legislative politics, their demands were shared and spread by other forces, not least the fascist movement. Wartime sacrifice was indeed vital to the appeal and self-image of fascism, which aimed at speaking for and even redeeming the Italian war effort. The resentment of many veterans for the material difficulties of demobilization and reintegration into civilian life, and the pressure for material and symbolic compensation gradually led to their associating with fascism, an eclectic movement that appealed to a variety of social and political actors. And I think that's exactly what probably what is interesting about recent scholarship is exactly trying to look at the eclecticism of the fascist movement and its components. On its turn, fascism succeeded in increasingly appropriating the symbol of the veteran, even the disabled one. Again, that's my point. So some scholars have exactly focused on this idea of appropriating the symbol of the veteran, also transnationally. My point is also to look specifically at the disabled one. So again, fascism was successful in appropriating the symbol to promote a clear-cut narrative of the conflict and politicize the existence with an emphasis on virile ultranationalism and on obedience to the state and its leader. And that's the end of my paper. Thank you.
Italiano.
Martina, grazie mille, è stato un intervento veramente molto interessante. Vi ho fatto delle domande, però prima di iniziare io magari hay alguien que quiere empezar con preguntas, o se no inicio. Allora, Mattia, tante domande, facciamone in due e sintetizzo. Allora, la prima, sono tutte e due relative al rapporto tra l'Associazione Nazionale per la Protezione e Assistenza agli Invalidi di Guerra e il fascismo. La prima di carattere un po' più generale. Che relazione c'è tra questa, se c'è, tra questa associazione e l'associazione fascista Famiglie Caduti, Mutilati e Feriti per la Rivoluzione, che mi pare sia del 24. Quindi è vero che questa è un'associazione per i caduti, mutilati, feriti per la rivoluzione fascista, però visto la stretta relazione tra veterani della Prima Guerra Mondiale e la nascita del movimento fascista, volevo sapere se c'è una qualche tipo di correlazione, collaborano.
L'associazione Mutilati e Invalidi
sì,
è questa?
Sì, cioè quella fascista e quella nazionale. Oppure se sono due entità completamente separate che si muovono su fronti separati. Poi un'altra cosa, in realtà una curiosità, non so se ha grande attinenza, quando tu prima menzionavi il fatto che c'è stato un tentativo forzoso di rimozione delle donne, no? Dal posto di lavoro pubblico per la sostituzione con questi veterani. E però allo stesso tempo è il periodo in cui, se non vado errata, sono gli anni in cui c'è una stretta collaborazione e poi con la collaborazione c'è una presenza forte, come dicevi tu, di veterani della guerra nei fasci di combattimento, no? E nel programma dei fasci, all'inizio, perché poi questo aspetto si perde, ad esempio c'era una certa invece riabilitazione dell'importanza della donna, no? Perché si propongono, di fatto il manifesto dei fasci, insomma, il programma dei fasci propone ad esempio il voto femminile. Quindi questa cosa di preservare questa mascolinità, no? Con la rimozione dei donne dai posti di lavoro pubblico, però da un'altra parte, visto il coinvolgimento massivo di veterani dentro nei fasci, che invece propongono, ad esempio, c'è un tentativo, no? di evoluzione del ruolo della donna, o quantomeno, se non proprio di evoluzione, comunque di inserimento, no? nella rappresentanza politica, che poi durante il ventennio si perde per completo, però all'inizio c'è. Quindi se c'è, insomma, non lo so, probabilmente sono due cose distaccate, però questo mi era venuto in mente, insomma, volevo un po' una tua opinione.
Rispondo in italiano, inglese, how do you prefer? In English. Yeah.
Abbiamo poi la terra in inglese, no?
Yeah. No, I imagine otherwise it's not so many languages, could be too much. No, thank you for your question, Georgia. Questions about the associations. I must say that I haven't found any correlation between the two. So if there was any negotiations, for sure. After 1925, and explain why all these associations contributed to and presided at different ceremonies, celebrating for sure both the fascist revolution as well as the end of the First World War. And I say this because more than the context between the groups is interesting what happened to war pensions. The fact that after 1925, war pensions were given also to the fascists. So, and there was this, pensions for those who had contributed to the fascist revolutions were equal to pensions for those who had fought in the First World War. So that's very interesting. And had been, in this case, the Associazione Mutilati e Invalidi di Guerra had been consulted when the law was designed. and they were not very happy about it, because obviously they were two different kind of experience, also over time. But then it was introduced. So I think that's very interesting. So that's why I say that definitely after 1925, when also were pensions, as I said, were equaled, all these groups, the groups that still existed, because again, Associazione Nazionale Mutilati Invalidi had been founded in 1917, and obviously was one of those allowed to persist. The same didn't happen to those who had been seen politically close to other parties. So obviously all these groups, as I said, were part of the celebration and ceremonies for the different anniversaries. And then again, obviously the closeness of the anniversaries of the fascist revolution and the end of the First World War up until 1924 had been a very heated, the kind of contributions also of the Associazione, even in 1924, to the ceremony to celebrate the fascist revolution. Many members didn't want to, because we know that 1924 again was a very particular year in Italian politics. And so for many, still again in 1924, not probably for the new leadership of the association, but for others, there should have been a distinction between the two ceremonies and the two anniversaries. Obviously, after 1925, it didn't exist anymore. So again, as I said, I don't know of exactly before 1925 of any kind, but it's interesting how obviously the fascist movement then took advantage and used the war pensions also to make those who contributed to the fascist revolution part of this war narrative. So then it was obviously a war narrative that started in 1914 for the fascists, let's say 1915, and continued afterwards. And the same we can see after with all the wars in the interwar period. And women and fascists, that's a very interesting one. Obviously, we know that exactly, as you said, one of the points the early fascism was to give the right to vote to women, something there. And we know that even some women that had contributed to the emancipation movement in Italy somehow felt that fascism could be the movement to bring some changes in Italy. Again, we're talking here obviously a small number of women, but still we know that this changed quite rapidly. And I think it's interesting to see from the documents, the material I went through, there was no consideration at all. So the economic dimension was so important for the veterans, and in particular, these questions of the employment and women to be kicked out of the public sector. I'm not the first one to mention, obviously, historians, especially those looking at the experience of women in fascism or looking at women and work. But I think here it's interesting to make exact a distinction between disabled veterans and veterans. I think it played a role. We see some of these protests were absolutely staged exclusively by disabled veterans. And I think the condition they felt that for them was very difficult to get employment. Not only because of the economic situation in Italy, but also because of their physical or, as I said, sensory condition, so their disability, made the tensions with female employment even higher, let's say. I haven't found any discussion of for example, women. But what is interesting, I think, is there were some observation about what about those women that were kicked out, but actually they were the only, the ones supporting disabled veterans who couldn't work. There was no discussion of it. That's very significant. It was just seeing women as sort of opponents and also to fight against because the resources were not many and men wanted to go back to work. I think it has very much to do with masculinity and association, obviously with breadwinning, employment, even authority, again, obviously being the breadwinner or contributing to family economy meant something for whoever somehow, but in particular I think in the case of these men who had been severely, but yeah, I haven't found any particular discussion of the votes, for example, of the women participating to fascism at the beginning, or again, if there was any contradictions here. As I said, we know that fascism abandoned very quickly the idea, for sure, of votes, but in particular votes to women very quickly.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions?
English,
Spanish if you prefer.
As you prefer, and yeah, I'll try to understand, otherwise I'll ask for help, so don't worry.
Muchas gracias por la presentación. Me ha gustado mucho, hice mi trabajo de final de grado sobre los veteranos estadounidenses que lucharon en la guerra de Vietnam, que volvieron con trastorno de estrés postraumático. Y además, mientras hacía el trabajo y iba seleccionando los temas, cuando llegué al de la masculinidad, pensé, bueno, esto, no sé, hay que introducirlo también o me estoy yendo demasiado para otro tema. Y ahora me ha gustado mucho ver en esta presentación, este seminario, cómo incluyes lo de la masculinidad, porque bueno, me he dado cuenta de que iba por buen camino. Vaya. El caso ha estado muy bien, me ha gustado mucho, pero la pregunta es otra, comparando el tema de los veteranos, de los combatientes que vuelven a casa. Pienso en Alemania, también en la Primera Guerra Mundial, pero fue precisamente sobre mi trabajo, sociólogo estadounidense Jerry Lemk decía algo que muy importante sobre los veteranos de Vietnam. Decía que eran los primeros desde los alemanes de la Primera Guerra Mundial, veteranos que se rebelaban de forma muy masiva contra el gobierno de su país. En este caso, mientras que en Alemania vimos como la República de Weimar hacía un arte, yo no sé decir respecto en la pintura, pero en el cine se vio mucho, sobre todo con la película El gabinete del Dr. Cagliari, esa denuncia, ese veterano trastornado era reflejado en la cultura popular. En el cine alemán y el cine de la República de Weimar, eso se vio mucho. En Italia se vio en la novela o en el cine algo parecido.
I think I'm okay, understood. Thank you very much. I think, can I comment also on your dissertation, your work? I think that's an important one because obviously the Vietnam War in a way changed also the way we perceive trauma, and now the question of post-traumatic stress disorder has somehow changed then also historiography, and the question how we use the notion of trauma also for previous conflicts. Obviously, again, making the distinction between when the notion of post-traumatic stress disorder was created, but still to think in particular about what I think is important. In my case, that as I said, I mostly work on physical disablement, that though can't be disconnected from trauma and sort of psychological dimension. So again, I think that's an important aspect. And Germany representation, that's a very good question. I confess that I've been asked about representation of disability in the Italian context, especially because the German one is so vivid of representation in paintings, as well as you mentioned here. Exactly, it's incredible. We don't have the same in Italy, and I confess I'm very happy to discuss with you why not the same. So in literature there might some aspects, in particular, again, I remember also in an article, one of the reviewers asked me exactly that. Can't we have more of these accounts? There are many. There are some for sure, but not many, not like in Germany. So why so? Again, we can say because the defeat in Germany was so determining that also that kind of defeat came out also in the representation of how veterans, in particular the disabled, what were their experience, both physical and mental disabled. Sometimes I wonder also it's a question of Catholicism, if it played a role in the representation or no representation of. One of my points is also, in particular, this is more than for the representation, for the personal accounts of what happened is, and I think I'm not the only one mentioning it, there's a sort of silence coming up because of this return. And the idea that after you return, you have there, and you're trying to readjust to life, you don't want to go back and or to explain what is your experience of disability and reintegration. You're just so busy with reintegrating yourself that it's very difficult to. But again, why then in Germany though? Also artists were represented. I think it was because the German context was a very particular one. And the German context is also interesting because we know that historians have engaged in why still veterans got one of the best welfare system, the German one, so the Weimar Republic, still were revolting against the authorities. So it's Deborah Cohen that I also mentioned is US historian that made this very important comparative work between Germany and Britain to see why Britain, the welfare measures for disabled veterans or veterans in general were not that generous compared to the German ones, though we have seen what happened to Germany and what happened to Britain. So again, obviously, it's the question of defeat and victory made a difference. So it's this question of the material and symbolic compensation. It's about the question of the political context in which these veterans return to. And I think the Italian case is, we know, being debated. We know, in terms of historians have been debated a lot, using especially these questions of victory, defeat, how this reintegration and this moral or symbolic, material or symbolic compensation helps in reintegrating them. Italy is in between because it's a victorious country, though again with the context is a very unstable one. And I think here it's though this governmental inefficiency and that made veterans, in particular the disabled one, feel very angry against the authorities. Sorry, to go back to your question about representation, there's not much. And if I think, for example, one case that I always mention is I mentioned here the association. The association created a fantastic headquarter, still in Rome available. You can go and see it. It's a huge building, and that was inaugurated in the mid-20s. Then large expanded later, obviously, but there are lots of frescoes. Interestingly, in the headquarters of the Associazione Nazionale Mutilati Invalidi, the depictions on those frescoes, you see some wounded people, but not really disabled. So I think it's this idea of depicting the body is always, there's some kind of reticence in showing exactly. So I'm very happy to discuss this because this is always my questions, why? Again, I'm trying to give some answers, but and I think I can get some of these answers obviously in discussing also other cases and understand more about, in a comparative way, we can try again to give answers to the differences that happened, I mentioned here, just across the European continent, both in terms, I think, of representation, as well as of the material recompensation for those who vote, because they can, I think they are both important. And sorry if I can extend my answer, because I think the question of representation though goes also back to how this image of the disabled veterans was used politically. And I think the moment that this convergence between the disabled veterans involved in the associazione and fascism happened there in 24, 25, again, these key years, I think obviously it determined also a clear-cut narrative of the war, where obviously it's also a positive image of this war rhetoric that uses the question of sacrifice in a specific way, where sacrifice goes well beyond seeing what is really the reality of those coming back, but it's just obviously a mythical sacrifice that, as I said, now going back also to Georgia, coalesce the war experience, First World War, with the fascist revolution. And so what I was in, the starting point of my project was exactly, but what were the experiences of these men actually? Because if I look, if I analyze the bulletin after 1924, obviously it's everything great. After the fascist, again, first the coalition government and the fascist regime, they were just doing great things for veterans. Was it the reality? It's very difficult, obviously, to try to find it, but obviously the reality was not that. But it completely disappeared, that kind of representation. So it's very hard to find it because you can find it only up until probably 1924, and still, again, in a limited way. Afterwards, it comes out only, in my case, from personal files, for example, those assisted, medically assisted, and there you have a different narrative of what was their relations to the authorities and their experiences. So it's also this contrast between the reality and the representation of disability, or again, the veteran experience.
Thank you so much. I found your presentation extremely interesting, and was commenting with Georgia in the middle of your presentation. It's very interesting. So just a couple of, probably ideas or questions or thoughts about some of your main points, I think. The first one is related to Danny's questions on representation, and I think that you mentioned that probably the main point is the so-called culture of defeat and culture of victory. So that's probably the main, I would say, it's just an idea, the main difference, because in Germany it's obviously much more clear that they lost the war. They are being humiliated during the Versailles Treaty and so on. So probably and as you know much better than me, the Italian case, it's not so clear. They won, but they so probably it could be an interesting point regarding why we have Nottingham and we have not Nottingham and Italian Nottingham, for example, or Chile, or of course, or Caligari. But this was not the main point. Probably, I think that I find that it's really interesting, your idea linking the building democracy, a social liberal democracy after the World War, and the failure of building democracy and disabled veteran. It's a very interesting point, I think, because I mean, in many senses, we could say that building this liberal democracy is kind of experiment of building democracy after the First World War. I think that probably we don't pay fully, I would say, attention to this point, because it's in many senses it's quite easy to understand why disabled veterans and other social groups finally look at fascism or even communism in senses, or even some other conservative groups in Europe, and not just in Italy. And it's very interesting because you explained very well this area. So why they are these disabled veterans are have several expressions politically, I mean, and why they finally approach to fascism. And it's a very dynamic process. I think I found that it's probably the most interesting point of your presentation. And I was wondering, I was thinking about that, because probably we I mean the historiography, we finally bought the fascist explanation in many. We believed the fascist explanation regarding disabled veterans, violence, trench experiences, and fascism. Of course, we know it very well, but it's much more complicated. It has probably, we have a lot of work to do regarding the failure of democracy, this experiment of democracy immediately after the First World War. And after all this introduction, the question is, why? What do you think about comparing cases? Of course, I don't know. It's a huge question, but because we know quite well what happens with veterans, not the type of veterans, but with veterans in France. This idea, the fascist explanation does not work at all. In France, we all know quite well what happens in Germany. We were supposed to know what would happen with Italy. It's not so clear. And of course in Britain. So the question is, could you give us some ideas, some interesting ideas, I'm sure, about if we could build a transnational explanation or not? We have just national cases, or is it possible to build some global, I would say, not global, but a broader explanation regarding probably not just with disabled veterans, but with veterans? What's your idea?
For the rise of fascism?
Yeah, the links between veterans, rise of fascism, immediate First World War, post-World War.
Yeah, actually, I think these years for me are the most interesting, exactly because I think now scholarship is trying. There was also my point, is trying to look at these veteran movements definitely more as varied, not as exactly previous scholarship used to do, is closer war experience than fascism, because we know the brutalization thesis, most, that obviously contributed a lot, but I think nowadays scholars are taking a distance, are really criticizing it, even if it contributed a lot for us to engage with the topic of obviously violence in the interwar period. But if we look at this experience, I think the transnational aspect, it helps me a lot to see exactly what veterans were doing though. Because I go back to that manifesto and I go back to 1918, the manifesto dell'associazione issued to the country, Italy. But what is interesting, and I'm working at the moment, is there were, I briefly mentioned, there were also transnational organizations of veterans. And in particular, they started as, not as veterans, they started in 1917, transnational organizations for the aftercare of the disabled. So again, the disabled played a role, but there were the authorities wondering across the belligerent countries, what do we do with these people? So starting to think about what happens afterward. So in 1917, I think again, as I said, is a crucial year, because it's not only trying to see, even if difficult, the end of the conflict, but also trying to see the afterwar period and to work towards it. But so these organizations, also these exchanging of best practice between different authorities across the belligerent countries started in 1917 in annual conferences, then 1918, 1919, so again 1917 in Paris, 1918 in London, 1919 in Rome. And this is a crucial year where veterans took the stage. And they declared they wanted to be part of that. They wanted to have a voice, also in determining what kind of measures they wanted, and also they wanted to be members of the different institutions. Think about, obviously, post-war year is when, 1919 is also not only the treaties and are important, but it's also the starting the League of Nations, the International Labour Organization office within it. They are crucial because, again, it's an institutional institution, so international institutions about labor. And one of the units of the International Labour Organization was devoted to disabled veterans. Because there was also, so it's exactly so what you mentioned here is building a liberal democracy, but also a new phase. So I think this can't be disjointed from the experience of disabled veterans, because they were the first to say we want to be there, and they were communicating to each other across countries. So the transnational dimension, we can't forget it. Then obviously there are the national contexts in which they acted, in which they acted. And I think here is also the response of the national governments, authorities. We go back to these what I mentioned here, in particular those scholars. We know I mentioned Robert Gebhardt, who's based in Dublin, is working a lot on the question of demobilization, and in particular exactly in a transnational framework, looking at in particular West-East Europe and the differences. So I think you're right. Only this transnational analysis helps us to understand there are general questions that I think, as again, it was envisioning a post-war world, but then there were specific realities that now I mentioned here in the 4 points which Idile and Gerhardt uses also to consider. There is also they are important because they make the distinction from one case to the next one, I think. And so in the Italian case, as I said, it's really this failure, the continuous failure of seeing this sacrifice, or this, as I said, there was a lot of discussion about this post-war vision, a sort of revolution. And we know that is across different groups, sort of new Italy that came from that experience. And obviously it's the meaning of this new Italy. So the one that prevailed was the fascist one at the end, but it was not the only one. And I think we should engage more with where the different visions. And why the fascist one then prevailed for different reasons, as I said, also because in a way the movement was very good in not only in the use of violence, unfortunately, and in getting the support of many conservatives and they obviously support also financial support, but also I think in taking advantage of this desire And in particular, as I said here, in my case, I see 1923, the war pensions as a moment of these negotiations. And even if the law had been designed previously by other governments, the signature on that law was the fascist one. And that contributed really to make the association getting closer to. And obviously, again, we see also a change in the leadership of the association. I think also there are individuals make also a difference. So while the association, in the early, 1919, 20, 21, also again presiding these transnational gatherings, they were mostly democratic personalities. Afterwards, they were nationalists, and then again, those who definitely embraced fascism were very happy to do that. So in 1924, there's also an attempt to say that the personal decision, as I said, that the new president of the association, Carlo Del Croix, he was elected to the parliament in the Listone, so with the nationalists. He was a nationalist. He never presented himself as fascist, but nationalist, very happy to embrace fascism, and supported Mussolini in 1924 in the Matteotto crisis. He voted again for Mussolini to say he was there. He supported him, and I think that's a crucial moment. So again, sorry to go back, is the transnational dimension absolutely important to understand these key years, 1918 up to the early 20s, but also the individual context that make it difficult. The response of veterans is difficult from one to the next one. Yeah.
It's very interesting what you mentioned during the presentation regarding your ideas and Guerra's vision on this area of this. To summarize it, it's not the war, but how movements read the war after the war.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting because we going back to the idea of the links between fascism, Great War, fascism, violence, and brutalization, and so on. It's very interesting that this year, 1919 or 1920, 21, the links between the post-war period, it's much more complicated than violence and fascism. I mean, you mentioned, I didn't know anything about that, this socialist league.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting because at least me, but I think that we used to think about communism or Bolshevik revolution, and well, they're pacifists, they don't want war, they have nothing to do with war but with revolution. And they are dealing with war so much. And it's much more dynamic, this explanation, that has to do with this idea I mentioned before, and you, of course, also mentioned, is the failure of building democracy.
Mm.
It's very interesting, going back to these years, between 18 and 23, 24, 25, from this focus, from this lens. We still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I think so.
On this
Yeah.
aspect, I think, rethinking the links between veterans or disabled veterans in your case and fascism from another point of view. It's strictly linked with this idea of failure of the problems of building a social liberal democracy.
Yeah, and if I can, for me the point is also exactly, so these were tensed years, where again violence happened, but my perspective is that we have also to engage with kind of violence, because there was not only the clashes between socialists, communists, and fascists. There were different kinds of violence. I think it's important trying to distinguish these different kinds of violence. Again, here I was mentioning protest,
protest staged. For sure, violence, again, also the threat of violence that disabled veterans in many cases used. Because they said, this is the last resort, we don't want to do that. But if you don't see us, again, it's a lot about visibility, then we have to use violence, to occupy. And we know, again, occupations in Italy, 1919, 1920, were key years where exactly the socialists were occupying lands. It was this idea of a new society, post-war societies, what vision to give. I think that's important. And that's exactly where I think as historians we should try to see these different visions and meanings attributed, both as we said, transnationally, because there were a variety of transnational movements here that obviously the war somehow contributed to. And I go back to that manifesto. These veterans, exactly, we should get rid of this, it's just violence, because they were talking about peace as well.
Yeah, sure.
They started to talk about peace, even with their former opponents, so enemies. Immediately in 1918, they started to talk about peace. So obviously there's a desire to build something else. And they also start to do some kind of building. The transnational networks that I mentioned, they were only for allied, again, those who had fought for the Entente and not the Central Powers. Late in the 20s, again, there's also an attempt to involve them as well. So it's very interesting, the veteran movement. There's interesting work done on the veteran movements, also in a transnational framework. I think it's very important. Again, because we shouldn't think of the veterans only exclusively as right-wing and fascist, but there's a very diverse movement. Though conditions then made them getting closer. And some of them definitely were very happy. They were fascists. I'm not saying that there were no fascists among them. Some of them were fascists since the very beginning. As I said, also the fascist movement had a great percentage of veterans. But we know also the fascist movement was very diverse at the very beginning. We mentioned with Georgia also this idea of giving the right to vote to women, and then abundance. Again, there were also somehow progressive ideas. We know, again, Mussolini had a socialist past. So all these different components are still there in these early post-war years. So different ideas and ways of perceiving and thinking of the future, the immediate future. The problem is when this immediate future didn't take the shape they wanted in terms of, as I said, measures, visibility. I think again is a lot is a symbolic compensation, not only the material one. I think was considered important for veterans.
Yo te quería hacer una pregunta, te la hago en castellano porque te va a ser más comprensible, lógicamente, que en inglés, o sea, seguro. Y que en italiano. Precisamente a raíz de lo que decíais ambos, el socialismo, ¿cómo apela el socialismo? ¿En qué términos? Porque has hablado del ultranacionalismo, la habilidad, del sacrificio, la violencia, del fascismo, pero el socialismo, ¿cómo apela a esos veteranos y a esos veteranos, digamos, heridos, mutilados de guerra, ¿no? Porque, claro, por otra parte, en Italia, precisamente, en el norte, tienes un socialismo que está ocupando cuotas de poder local y un sindicalismo que está gestionando también, o que aspira a gestionar bolsas de trabajo a nivel local. Entonces, y eso paradójicamente también contribuye a la deslegitimación de esas élites liberales, ¿no?
Yeah.
Y justamente creo que en eso también hay un papel clave, que eso también nos liga a esta cuestión transnacional, ¿no? De la fortaleza del Estado, o de un Estado que se está inhibiendo en favor de un fascismo en las calles que combate a ese socialismo que está ocupando cuotas de poder, de un proceso precisamente de democratización, no revolucionario, sino de democratización a nivel local. Entonces, hay un juego ahí del Estado también, ¿no? Decantándose, no es solo el poder o el fascismo que sea muy sexy, ¿no? Sino que también es un Estado que precisamente está jugando una pieza clave en ese juego de decantar, ¿no? esa fuerza hacia el fascismo. Y luego, en este sentido que decíamos a nivel transnacional, también me parece súper interesante ver lo que decías tú, y en relación a lo que dice Gerhard, ¿no? También uno de sus componentes es la fortaleza del Estado, porque tenemos escenarios de violencia en Italia, país victorioso, aunque con una crisis galopante a nivel político, económico, social y demás, escenarios de violencia en España, brutales, que no participan de la experiencia bélica, escenarios de violencia en Portugal, que es un Estado que también sale victorioso, pero resulta que y su participación es muy menor, pero también escenarios de violencia terribles. Y luego no en Francia, donde el Estado es más fuerte, digamos, y donde está basculando hacia un sindicalismo más reformista, ¿no? Entonces ahí yo creo que el Estado juega una pieza fundamental y que tiene que estar en la ecuación necesariamente. Y luego eso, ¿no? Como el socialismo apela a esos veteranos.
Yeah, thank you. As I said, exactly. In particular, there was for veterans there was this Lega Proletaria, which was close to the Socialist Party as well as the Labour Union. So, and that's important. And I think it's also, exactly, it was appealing to part of the veterans. And they had important leaders within the Lega, one was also, so not just one, was also MPs, so members of the parliament. So again, they were definitely present. We know exactly the Socialist Party in post-war Italy was very successful in general as well as local elections. And so we can see, to go back to the question, veterans were among also the Socialist Party, and also many veterans, also those sitting in Parliament. So I think that's important, exactly. It's not a veterans only right extremist or appealing, or only conservatism appealing to veterans. What is interesting is if I think about the case of the Lega, as I said, first of all, the name. I think also the name is important. Obviously, this proletarian league, and also for them is this association. They called their members or their target were victims. Obviously, again, what war was meant for socialism. So obviously, that's also this idea. In here, the compensation and asking for compensation was because these were the victims of that specific state structure and obviously of sort of pre-revolution system. And they saw also an association between war victims and working class. So there's also clear. So this was appealing. As I said, it was definitely a smaller group compared to the Associazione Nazionale Mutilati Invalidi, which didn't see very positively the Lega Proletaria, even if, again, it proclaimed itself as a political, but in many cases it had anti-socialist stances. Again, we might say here because of its leadership, because it didn't want to mingle with the political or explicitly political scene by presenting itself close to one party or the other. And I think what is interesting here is how sometimes some of the socialist MPs were close also to the Lega Proletaria were not well seen by the Associazione Nazionale, even when discussing and proposing measures in parliament. So again, I think these anti-socialist stances still are to be considered within parts of the veteran movement. And then, yeah, you're right, there's also, we know one of the problems is also, exactly, if we look at this vision of building of a new liberal democracy here, but there are also the failures of the state and the use of the monopoly of the state monopoly of violence was faulty, or in some cases willingly, because again supporting in any case the fascists rather than other forces, or more than supporting, closing some eyes here, again more than supporting. And I think though the monopoly of violence at a certain point completely failed in Italy. That's one of the factors also mentioned by Idele and Guerra that are important for us to pay attention to. Exactly the Bolshevist revolution and the appeal of that revolution for many. I think it contributed also to what happened in Italy at that moment. The failure of the state monopoly of violence, and as I said, also this compensation. So all these components and factors are important. And today I underline some that were, but I think all the factors are key. And so when you say socialism in a way contributed to the delegitimization of the liberal state, it did, because obviously again also the socialists were there to change. So the revolution, the question of revolution was key. And again, it's what meanings attributed to this revolution, because many were using the term revolution. Veterans, since their manifesto used it, not a socialist revolution, probably again more a liberal democratic one, but not clearly enough. As I said, some other veterans were actually socialists though. So it's for us as historians was interesting is exactly what this revolution, the meanings that this revolution took in these key years.
Pero a pesar de que estuvieran hablando de revolución, los socialistas participaban de los mecanismos legales.
Yeah, exactly.
Precisamente, ¿no? Era esa idea de luchar contra la revolución, en cambio lo que estás luchando es contra la democratización del Estado, ¿no? Quizás. O sea, que me parece como interesante, ¿no? Ese papel del socialismo legalista y a la vez revolucionario que quizás se quiere evitar, ¿no? También esa vía legalista que es donde está consiguiendo también pues eso, ¿no? Cuotas de poder y está consiguiendo llevar a cabo.
That's why the German case is so relevant. Because they are leading the process, they are writing, not they, but they are leading the writing of a new constitution, very experimental one, I mean the line of work. And just another point regarding what you were mentioning about adding elements to your proper explanation. Probably the other relevant point is the so-called Red Scare. I mean, not the revolution, but the scare about the myth of the revolution that is about to come.
Yeah.
It's a very relevant one, mainly not probably in the Italian case, not only in the Italian case, and probably not. It is not the main point in the Italian case, but in other ones. Spain, it's very relevant. Portugal, Germany, of course, and even Latin America.
But I think
it's a transnational phenomenon.
Exactly, it is a transnational phenomenon. But at the same time, I think it's very much related to your points here. There was a Red Scare in Italy too, even though exactly the Socialist Party then decided actually not to go for the revolution. But still, the Red Scare obviously was used as a
I was mentioning, I was saying that not relevant in Italy because I think that it's much more important after the March on Rome in Europe. Because after the March on Rome, there's not a communist threat. Really. It's much more the building of the myth about the revolution, the Soviet that is about to come.
I confess that when you were talking, I don't know if I'm right. Obviously, we're not talking about a conflict, but this failure of democracies I'm thinking about nowadays. Since there's lots of discussions about the failure of democracies. You mentioned here Red Scare, that is again, it's one of these tropes that is continuously used and still nowadays is so appealing somehow. Obviously it's a different ways of understanding Red Scare and obviously it's a different context in which we can try to understand the failure of democracies. But again, we don't come from a global conflict, probably from many different conflicts across the globe though. There's a current one in the Middle East, but it's interesting again that this failure of democracy is still there. So, and I think here after a global conflict, there was this idea, also coming from those who had fought in the conflict, to try to build something new, and I say, in particular, thinking about democracy piece, but then democracy in different countries, though, completely failed. So again, it's yeah, I think it's very interesting. Lots of work to do. But I'm curious, do you have curiosity, anything that you wanna on these points, my own research, that would like again to?
I do have one question.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's strictly related to this point, but it is related to the question of socialism and the Italian case. The understanding that I have from fascism, that it's a very complicated subject to study because it has so many forms, and it's very, you can be, I think, too specific and also too broad, like in all the terms, but in fascism it's especially important to define it well because it was a very big threat, and it still is, to the human condition. But the image that I have of fascism is the most savage capitalism, the most savage form capitalism can take. The state enters in a symbiotic relation with the bourgeoisie, and the state suppresses the unions, and then the bourgeoisie is at the service of the national interest. So I would like your opinion on this definition, but also when the state enters in this relation, the bourgeoisie expects the earnings to rise. But Mussolini, in this case, was offering that welfare to the veterans. Those promises of welfare that would have meant more state spending, and to get that money the state would have to increase the taxes, where I'm not sure about this welfare was given to the veterans where they fought, and which were the economic relations, in this case with the promises of fascism, the actions of fascism, and the reaction also of the population from the bottom to the top.
Oh wow, there are many important questions here. Now, starting with the definition of fascism. Obviously, there are many definitions of fascism, and I think scholars, when I teach exactly fascism, I start with the many definitions. It's always complicated. For sure, we can use a sort of I don't know, Marxist definitions where you look at, in particular, the economic component. I think it's also interesting to look, and I mentioned here, sort of a more cultural definition, or a cultural approach, sorry, more than a cultural definition, a cultural approach to fascism. And I think, in the sense we mentioned here, as I said, the symbolic use of some images, including that of the veteran, I think is important to be seen also from definitely a cultural point of view. But we shouldn't forget, you mentioned here the economy, in terms also, if the fascist regime was promising this help, was it real? So did it happen? And I think obviously in this case we should try to look at the budget and what kind of information. That is not easy, obviously, because as you might note, information on what were the real conditions of veterans were not publicized or reported. As I can say, though, it's, as I said, I'm using kind of personal files, for example, where you see that, yeah, many of the measures were in place, but there wasn't much money, actually. So one is, again, what was reported, the successful welfare system, was it really successful? Was it perceived as successful by veterans in terms of really helping them to? Not really. But obviously there was a censorship, there's no kind of reporting or with the authorities. If not, again, I think here the organizations, the associations are key, because still they work as mediators within a dictatorship, but as sort of mediators. So again, the different aspects we might pay attention to, I mentioned here, is also who are these mediators, what kind of role they played in the fascist regime, and again, how can we also try to understand negotiation and mediation within a fascist regime. And I say that because, tell me if I'm not entirely replying to your question, but one of my points is I was looking at the case of the blinded servicemen, in particular because there's a fantastic archive in Florence, in Italy, of this center for rehabilitation that lasted for many years after the end of the war, and then again transformed itself. So I could access again personal files and correspondences between the leader of the association that was a key personality in the fascist regime. But he was also able to negotiate again the issue of some measures, the establishment of some activities that really promoted disabled, in particular the blinded, attributing them a role that they hadn't before. So here it's very difficult within a fascist regime, though disabled. Again here, blinded veterans and also blind civilians could achieve some things that they didn't have or they didn't have advantage before fascism. So again here, agency and also the role of particular individuals, how to read them, and I think it's very complicated because obviously these people collaborated with fascism. They had key roles within fascism, but at the same time, they contributed to the advancement of the situation and conditions of disabled people. And I say here people in general because he was, again, this leader, he was a veteran, blinded veteran, but his point was this advantage should not only be for veterans, but for civilians, so disabled civilians. So that's, I think it's fascinating, but how to read it within a fascist regime. So he took advantage, obviously, he negotiated, he contributed, he took advantage of the context in which he was. I don't think he went through the process after the fall of fascism, because he was considered a fascist. So at the same time, still in Florence, you go, there's an institution, a street on his name, because he contributed a lot to the cause of the blind. So it's very interesting here. So there's some work done on Spain on the case of the Spanish veterans, obviously, of the civil war, and again, we try as disabled historians often to engage with a question of a hierarchy within different. Both the disabilities but also the conflict. Now, we mentioned earlier on war pensions for fascists given after 1925. Same happened in Spain, where pensions were given to obviously those who fought for the nationalists and not to the others. So again, not to the Republicans, forgotten. So I think it's very interesting here. In the Italian case, as I said, it's more complicated because still those who were not fascists were entitled to war pensions. Even so, again, socialists were still entitled to, so after the rise of fascism. But it's how then war pensions and the symbol of the veterans was appropriated. So then the fascists were given war pensions. So as I said, here is a continuation of what war meant. The First World War meant in connection to the fascist revolution was a sort of continuation again. And that's interesting. So I think it's paying attention to all these, that's why I'm saying the symbolic meanings, but also how measures were used in order to promote or not some specific groups, categories, and that's important. Again, I don't. Please tell me if I haven't entirely answered your question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your question. And I don't know, other comments or questions, also in connections to your research or what you do, your interest.
Sorry for bothering you, but just to now a couple of questions, more questions we wanted, but just a little short.
I have one question because, well, lately I'm doing my final dissertation of my degree about biography. I just wanted to know what potential may have the individual role and agency in analyzing these sort of, very complex things that you said, and contradictions and movements, because, I think that looking the individual role in analyzing that sort of very large dynamics and international dynamics also give us a very complex and interesting sight of what was going on then. So I would like to give us very interesting, I'm sure very interesting thoughts about this potential that individual role has and plays in the construction of these realities.
Yeah. No, thank you. I think that's a very good point, exactly. Because if I say that this is a composite movement, how to, in a way, how to make it clear, probably exactly one way could be to use some personal trajectories to show how varied the movement was. And I try to do that exactly in different years. One personality I mentioned here is this leader of the blinded, but there are others. In his case, can I also say, very interestingly, he also came from Trentino. So again, actually, he in the First World War, he was meant to fight for the Habsburg Empire, so against Italy, but then he was one of those who volunteered for the Italian army. So very interesting. And so if you focus on biography and individual trajectory, obviously there are different aspects of their experience, and I would say also identities that play a role. As I said, also regional or origin, so where they come from. And I personally am very interested in also what happened to those who became new citizens of the Kingdom of Italy, the South Tyrol, so the German speakers as well. What happened to them? Personally, I'm very interested in that as well. Because there are all these changes and the inclusion of new citizens that were first so enemies, but then new citizens of the Kingdom of Italy. And again, personal trajectory made highlight some questions of, again, political leaning or allegiance might be different, and how choices change according to also the change in context and political and social one. So I think it's actually is a very good way to try to understand this composite movement. Here is also trying to, obviously, to pick some individuals that somehow we might think are representative of the variety of the movement. There's not yet a biography of Carlo Del Croix, who was the leader of the Associazione Nazioni Mutilate Invalidi di Guerra. There are lots of works mentioning him. There's not a biography. I think would be very interesting. I think his family probably not very happy in sharing his again, the family is also very right-wing and conservative. But I think it's very important to understand, and for and I finish, for the personality I mentioned earlier on, is also to look exactly to what happened to them after fascism. So I mentioned this, not the leader of the blinded, he went through the fascization trials. So So there was a discussion, and we had there a discussion about what it meant to collaborate with fascism. So he was considered, and he enriched himself. As I said, he obviously was one of the important personality. He led different organization institutions, but still he also promoted disabled people. How to read that? It's very complex. And so I think agency is important. It's one of these questions that also in scholarship, especially in the last decades, is it overemphasized the importance of agency? What do we mean with agency? I think it's important, though. It helps us really understand, especially when we have to deal with dictatorships. It's often the question, can we talk of agency within a fascist dictatorship? I think we can. Personal choices within that framework are interesting aspects to look at. The reasons why, the context in which the people act, and how they benefited of what they were doing, but also, again, if they were able to take advantage of that, in this case, not only for their own personal situation, because as I said, that guy enriched himself a lot, but also for others, and in what ways, and what lasted afterwards, and in what ways, and how, again, it was perceived and even reinterpreted, if it was the case, after the fall of fascism. So the legacies of fascism are, I think, something else very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you've talked about collective identity of the veteran, right? And my question is, the fascists, they used to use the veterans' petitions to fit themselves as movements. But in the other way, this collective identity, excuse me, they did fit the fascist way of interpreting of their reality. This fit was bidirectional, or it was only in one direction? This point of view of the veterans, for example, their sociality rituals, their point of view of the reality, they fitted the fascist ideology?
Yeah, I think exactly. Now, since we mentioned here individuals, and then obviously there's also collective action, as I said here, and to look at it as a social movement. So in particular, we look at collective actions and also identity, because I think at the moment they, first of all, created an Associazione Nazionale Mutilati Invalidi and used this as both, as I said, a badge of honor, because they sacrificed themselves, but also it was the way they had to negotiate. It's exactly defined themselves as, so they shared a common identity, let's say. Within each of them, and tried also to make it clear, then emphasize different characteristics of themselves, geographical origin, political allegiance, whatever, and I think also it's important. So if I understood correctly, is also, how the fascists also try to use the way of employing the collective identity appropriated it.
The question was, that the fascists try to use the petitions of the veterans and their petitions to fit their movement. But this point of view of the veterans fit also the fascist way to see their reality, to see their ideology. Their petitions have any influence of the fascist ideology, or the fascist ideology was created before that and they had yet their own point of view of the reality?
No, we are talking here of those key years where there was no fascist ideology. So now, again, we mentioned the fascist movement was created in 1919, and as I said, it was a mix. First of all, a small group, and increased, but with a variety. We got composite as well. But so these are key years exactly because the fascist movement is able to and take advantage of what is happening around them, including a movement of veterans and disabled veterans. So definitely is taken from them, and it's taken from them because the movement was huge. The association was huge. So while fascist movement was small, the association had lots of. So we say in 1921, 300,000 members. So again, this is huge. So for fascism was definitely important. And I'm talking only of the Associazione Nazionale Mutilati e Invalidi. So I think that's also why I'm saying that we have to consider disabled in particular, because this is what the main association of veterans actually in Italy at that time. And they were disabled. Some are permanently disabled, some are short-term disabled, but still, again, they identified, as you said, themselves as disabled, and that's how they negotiate with the public sphere in different ways. So the fascist movement was supporting them, again, Il Popolo d'Italia, since they established themselves, and then the fascist movement was absolutely always trying to get in touch and probably some of those members were also close to fascist movement. So there was, again, a sort of communication going on. And so I think the association was key. And I think that's exactly, if we want to understand how evolved also the fascist movement itself, that I think, obviously, I'm not the only one saying that, it's a social movement, so it's a composite, political movement, more than, probably I'd say that, but it's composite, and it was changing exactly because there was no ideology. It was really in transformation. So who were the different actors with whom the fascist movement was also engaged with? I think is important for us to try to understand what was then the evolution of the situation in Italy. So definitely I think it was a sort of bidirectional kind of.
Maybe it's not so ideological as you just said. So actually, the ideology of fascism started to structure itself after the merge with the Nationalist Association.
Yeah.
So basically, the nationalist component gave some ideological structure to the movement, and it's in 1924. But still, of course, the common field, let's say, between veterans and the very first fascists was the myth of the Great War. So the common field is this one. So it's not that they use, but they meet in halfway, let's say, about this interpretation of the Great War, where Italians fought for this nation, no? So the myth of the Great War starting to merge with the myth of the nation, the rebirth of the nation, people who fought for the nation during the war, and then a nation that should be recreated under a new perspective. And this is the common base, I think, the common, let's say, field between these veterans that went to the battlefield, and then the fascists that have this, the fascist movement basically born from the Great War, no? So at the beginning, at least, I would say the first years, the common point is this myth of the Great War.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there is more connection after the merge between the fascist movement, the fasci di combattimento, let's say, and the Associazione Nazionalista Italiana. Starting from the point, there are more like ideological elements within the fascist party at the time. But still, ideology, maybe, as Martina said, not at the beginning, but still this common point.
Yeah, some elements, exactly. It's really an evolution, and thank you, George. I think it's about interpretation of nation, obviously, and I think also sacrifice. So we have different ideas. We go back also to the socialists, and sacrifices. We are victimhood. We are victims here, not only of the war, but who caused the war here, obviously. There's a particular reading of reality and the context. So it's about the sacrifice of nations, and here we have different interpretations. Some merged, some others contrasted, and then obviously then one prevailed somehow, and also violently prevailed. But I think there are different ideas in this post-war, early post-war period years.
Thank you.
So I will say that it was a very productive discussion. Thank you to Martina for her wonderful lecture, and we will see you next month with Nico Sesmo.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your question. Thank you.